They told him to step aside, and they said it loud enough for everyone to hear. The jet bridge fell quiet in that unnatural way, the kind of silence that presses against the ears. Harold Bennett froze, with one hand still wrapped around the leather handle of his carry-on. 68 years old, grey hair cut neat, a navy blazer that had seen better decades. Nothing about him looked threatening. Nothing about him looked important. And that, apparently, was the problem. "Sir, this will only take a moment," the gate agent said again, voice tight, rehearsed. Her smile was thin, professional, already apologetic in advance for whatever came next. Behind Harold, the line of passengers shifted. Shoes scuffed the floor. Someone sighed. Somewhere down the concourse, an announcement chimed, cheerful and cruelly out of place. Harold felt his heart pick up speed, not from fear, but from recognition. This feeling had a long memory. It went back to lunch counters and bank offices and boardrooms where he had learned, early on, that dignity was something you guarded quietly. Because once you raised your voice, they stopped listening. "I'm boarding with Group 1, he said calmly. He held up the boarding pass. "First class, seat 2D. His name printed clean and correct. The agent did not take it. Her eyes flicked past him, toward the glass wall where a uniformed supervisor was already walking over. Tall man, late 40s, buzz cut. Security posture even without a badge. "It's just a quick verification," she said. "We've had some inconsistencies." Harold noticed how she did not say what kind. The supervisor arrived and took the boarding pass without asking. He studied it longer than necessary, turned it over, tapped it against his palm. The camera would have caught the details if anyone had been filming. The way Harold's jaw tightened, the way his shoulders stayed level, the way he breathed slow through his nose. "You traveling alone today, Mr. Bennett?" the supervisor asked. "Yes." "Purpose of your trip?" There it was. Not a question they asked the couple ahead of him. Not a question they asked the man in the tailored suit, now watching openly from a few feet away. "Visiting family," Harold said. True enough. Family came in many forms. The supervisor nodded, but his eyes stayed sharp. "We're just going to need you to wait right here." He handed the boarding pass back like it was a courtesy. The jet bridge door remained open. Boarding continued around Harold, bodies brushing past him, eyes darting away quickly, as if whatever was happening might be contagious. A woman in her 70s caught his eye as she passed. Her mouth tightened in something like sympathy or warning. Harold stepped aside, not because he was told, because he chose not to block the flow. Control, he had learned, was often about when you moved, not whether you were pushed. The supervisor spoke quietly into his radio. The agent pretended to rearrange paperwork that did not need rearranging. Harold listened to the sounds. The hum of the plane's auxiliary power unit. The echo of rolling suitcases. His own heartbeat, steady now. He felt the familiar split inside himself. The part that felt the insult, and the part that observed it with cold clarity. He thought of 1963. Of his father's hands, rough and steady, folded on the steering wheel, while they waited for a police officer to finish asking questions that had no right answers. He thought of how his father had said nothing, and everything at the same time. The supervisor returned. "Mr. Bennett, there's a discrepancy with your reservation history." Harold met his eyes. "What kind of discrepancy?" The supervisor hesitated. Just a fraction. Long enough to matter. "Our system flagged it." "Flagged what?" Harold asked. The supervisor glanced around, lowering his voice. "Sometimes seats get reassigned. Complimentary upgrades. Corporate holds. It happens." Harold smiled then. Not wide, not friendly. Just enough to show he had heard every word. "So you think I'm sitting in a seat meant for someone else?" "I'm saying we need to make sure," the supervisor replied. Behind him, a man in his early 60s cleared his throat loudly. "This is ridiculous," the man said. "He's got a boarding pass." The supervisor ignored him. Harold felt something shift in the air, attention tightening, a small crowd forming without realizing it had formed. "Would you like me to step back to the gate desk?" Harold asked. "Or are you planning to do this here?" The supervisor blinked. The question landed heavier than it sounded. "Gate desk," he said. They walked together, side by side, not escorted, not free. The distance felt longer than it was. The terminal lights were bright, unforgiving, bleaching color from faces. Harold noticed his reflection in the glass, older than he felt, tired but not weak. At the desk, the supervisor typed fast, too fast. The agent leaned in, whispering. Harold caught fragments. Corporate note, internal hold, unusual profile. Unusual. He almost laughed. "Mr. Bennett," the supervisor said finally, "we're going to need to rebook you." There it was. Clean, simple, spoken like a policy, not a choice. Harold tilted his head. "I paid for that seat." "Yes, sir. I selected it weeks ago." "Yes, sir. And now you're telling me I can't have it." The supervisor did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the jet bridge, toward the clock, toward the growing risk of delay. "We can offer you another flight later this evening," he said, "or a seat in economy on this one." Harold felt the heat rise then, slow and dangerous. Not anger. Memory. The accumulation of moments that looked just like this one. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only the supervisor could hear. "Do you know what happens when you make a mistake like this?" The supervisor stiffened. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." "I know," Harold said. "So am I." That landed wrong. He saw it in the man's eyes. Confusion first, then irritation. "And what exactly is your job, Mr. Bennett?" the supervisor asked. Harold looked past him, through the glass, at the plane, at the cockpit door he knew would close soon, at the crew moving with practiced precision, at systems layered on systems, all of them depending on people doing the right thing for the right reasons. He reached into his jacket, slow enough to be visible, pulled out his phone. Old model, cracked case, nothing impressive. He unlocked it and scrolled, thumb steady. Found the contact. Paused. Not yet, he thought. Not here. "I'll take the later flight," Harold said. The supervisor exhaled, relief flickering across his face before he could stop it. "Thank you for your cooperation." Harold nodded. Cooperation. Another word with history. As the plane door closed and the jet bridge pulled away, Harold stood alone at the gate desk. The terminal noise rushed back in. Life moving on. The agent slid a new boarding pass across the counter. "We're very sorry for the inconvenience," she said. Harold took it, folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket like a receipt. As he turned away, his phone vibrated once. A text message. No words. Just a reminder. Board meeting confirmed. All members present. Harold allowed himself a small breath then. Not relief. Resolve. They thought this was about a seat. They always did. And somewhere high above the runway, Flight 817 lifted into the sky, carrying with it a decision that would echo far beyond a single gate, a single flight, a single old man who knew exactly how much silence was worth, and when it was time to break it. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old carpet glue, the kind of room designed to look neutral and ended up feeling accusatory. Harold Bennett sat alone at the long table, hands folded, jacket draped over the back of his chair, watching the city through a narrow strip of glass. Afternoon light slid between buildings in Washington, cutting the room into hard angles and shadow. No one had kept him waiting on purpose. That was the worst part. The delay had come from calendar conflicts, overlapping calls, people assuming someone else would handle it. A system working exactly as designed, until it met something it did not recognize. The door opened without ceremony. A woman in her late 50s entered first, silver hair pulled tight, glasses low on her nose. Margaret Sloane, General Counsel. She carried a thick folder and the kind of expression that came from decades of solving problems before they became disasters. Two men followed her, both mid-60s, both wearing the relaxed confidence of people used to being listened to. The board chair, William Hargrove, and the chief operating officer, Alan Pierce. They stopped when they saw Harold. For half a second, the room misfired. William recovered first. "Harold," he said carefully, "you didn't say you'd be here in person." "I didn't know I needed permission," Harold replied. His voice was even, not sharp. That was intentional. Margaret closed the door behind her and set the folder down slowly, as if speed might turn it into something else. "We were told there was an incident at Dunnis," she said. "A passenger complaint." "A decision," Harold corrected. "Made by your people, in your name." Alan frowned. "This is about a seat assignment." Harold turned his head and looked directly at him. Alan shifted his weight, just slightly. The smallest tells always came first. "It's about a pattern," Harold said. The seat was just where it happened this time. William pulled out a chair and sat. He did not invite Harold to speak. He did not need to. The air had already tilted. Margaret opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, policy excerpts highlighted in pale yellow. She adjusted her glasses. "We've had a preliminary look," she said. "There have been complaints over the past few years. Nothing that rose to litigation. Mostly resolved quietly." "Quietly for whom?" Harold asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. She flipped a page. Her jaw tightened. She knew the answer. Alan crossed his arms. "With respect," he said, "we serve millions of passengers a year. A handful of misunderstandings doesn't indicate systemic failure." Harold leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked softly. "A handful," he repeated. "That's what you call it when you don't count the ones who stopped complaining." William rubbed his temple. "Harold, you're here as an advisor, not an investigator." Harold smiled then. Not kind, not cruel, just precise. "I'm here because the Transportation Compliance Review is scheduled in 90 days, and your internal metrics are already red in 3 categories." That landed. Alan uncrossed his arms. Margaret looked up sharply. William exhaled. "You're not supposed to be involved in that review." "I wasn't," Harold said. "Until yesterday." Silence pressed in. The city outside continued its indifferent motion. Margaret closed the folder. "We need to understand the exposure," she said carefully. "If this becomes public, it already is," Harold interrupted. "Not loudly, not yet, but the complaints are indexed, the language patterns are consistent, age, appearance, race, always framed as comfort, safety, procedure." Alan shook his head. "Our policies are clear." "They're vague," Harold replied, "and vagueness is a weapon when it's held by the wrong hands." William stood and walked to the window, back to the room. "So what is it you want?" he asked. Harold considered the question. He thought of the jet bridge, of the supervisor's relieved face when Harold stepped aside, of how easily the system had exhaled once the inconvenience removed itself. "I want you to look at the footage," Harold said. Margaret frowned. "What footage?" "The cameras at the gate, the audio logs, the internal notes entered after I was rebooked. And I want you to do it without deciding first what it means." Alan scoffed. You're asking us to second-guess our staff based on one incident? No, Harold said. I'm asking you to remember who your staff are trained to doubt. The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. Thicker, less polite. Margaret broke it. We'll review everything, she said. But understand this, Harold. If we escalate, regulators escalate. That helps no one. Harold met her gaze. It helps the people who keep getting moved. William turned back around. His face had aged in the last few minutes. You didn't identify yourself at the gate, he said. Harold nodded. I didn't need to. Alan leaned forward. You let them rebook you? Yes. Why? Harold paused. He chose his words carefully, because this part mattered, because I wanted to see what the system would do when it thought it was safe. Margaret inhaled sharply. You baited them, Alan said. I observed them, Harold replied. There's a difference. William stared at the table. If this comes out, he said slowly, we lose control of the narrative. Harold stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor. You never had control, he said. You had silence, and you mistook it for agreement. He picked up his jacket and draped it over his arm. For a moment, none of them moved. Harold, Margaret said, if we do this your way, people will lose their jobs. Harold looked at her, really looked. People have been losing dignity for years, he said. Jobs recover. That doesn't. He walked to the door, then stopped with his hand on the handle. You have a choice, he said without turning around. You can fix this before it gets named, or you can wait until it does. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt final. In the hallway, Harold's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Internal review triggered. You were right. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. Outside, the city felt colder, louder, alive. Somewhere across town, a supervisor would finish a shift without knowing why their access badge would stop working tomorrow. Somewhere else, a passenger would board a plane and sit without being questioned, never knowing how close the balance had tipped. And in 90 days, a system would be asked a question it could no longer dodge. Not about a seat, about who was allowed to stay in it. The email arrived just after sunset, quiet and precise, the way serious things often are. Subject line neutral. Internal alignment review. Harold Bennett read it once, then again, standing at his kitchen counter while the kettle screamed itself hoarse behind him. He turned the stove off without pouring the water. His reflection in the dark window looked older than it had that morning, not weaker, just more resolved. Across the city, in a glass tower that still smelled faintly of new money and old fear, Margaret Sloane sat with her shoes kicked off under her desk, rereading a transcript she had not meant to open tonight. Gate audio, time-stamped, clean, damning in its restraint. No slurs, no shouting, just pauses, just assumptions spoken like facts. The kind of language that never made headlines, but built graves underneath reputations. She pinched the bridge of her nose. This was not going to be containable. Alan Pierce was pacing when she called him. He did not bother with pleasantries. This is turning into something else, he said. It already was, Margaret replied. We just didn't want to see it. The board will panic. They should, she said. They've been mistaking calm for compliance. Alan stopped pacing. Silence stretched between them, filled with the hum of a building that never slept. He knew, Alan said finally. Yes. He let it happen. Yes. That makes him dangerous. Margaret closed the transcript. No, she said. That makes him honest. At Dulles, the supervisor from Gate 34 sat alone in his car, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel long after his shift had ended. He had replayed the moment a dozen times. The boarding pass, the tone, the relief when the older man stepped aside. He had told himself it was procedure. He had told himself everyone did it. But the feeling had followed him out of the terminal like a shadow that refused to let go. His phone buzzed. An automated message. Access review pending. Contact HR. He stared at the screen, heart pounding now, not with guilt, but with the sickening realization that the system always knew more than it said. Harold spent the evening making calls he had not planned to make. Not to power, to memory. A retired flight attendant he had known years ago, a former compliance officer who had left the industry quietly, a pastor who flew twice a month to see his grandchildren and had learned to pack patience like an extra coat. Patterns emerged, familiar, exhausting. The same phrases, the same outcomes. Always polite, always reasonable, always wrong. By the time Harold sat down at his desk, the room felt charged, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. He opened a folder he had not touched in years. Old notes, old reviews, names that had faded, but never disappeared. He was not building a case. He was finishing one. The next morning, Horizon Air issued a statement that said nothing and everything. Commitment to values. Internal review underway. No admission, no denial. The stock barely moved. Analysts shrugged. The world turned. Inside the company, though, the air changed. Employees whispered. Emails were forwarded, then unsent. Meetings ended early. HR calendars filled. Legal requested silence and got compliance, but not comfort. Someone leaked a screenshot to a private forum. Someone else recognized the language. Margaret watched it spread with the sinking certainty of someone who had spent a career preventing fires and now smelled smoke inside the walls. At 10:30, she was summoned upstairs. William Hargrove did not look up when she entered. He was older than most people realized, the kind of man whose authority had always arrived before he did. Today it felt thinner. "Tell me we can manage this," he said. Margaret did not sit. "We can manage the response," she said. "We cannot manage the truth." He finally looked at her. "You sound like him." She nodded. "That's because he's right." William leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. "I built this place on efficiency." "And efficiency," Margaret said gently, "has a blind spot." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with decisions deferred too long. At the same time, across town, Harold walked into a nondescript office building with no signage and excellent security. The receptionist smiled, recognized him, and waved him through without a word. Inside, the conference room was smaller than the one from the day before. No windows, no pretense. 3 people waited, all older, all tired in the way that came from carrying weight quietly. "You should not have been there," one of them said. "I know," Harold replied. "And yet you were." "Yes." A woman with steel-grey hair studied him. "You understand what happens next?" Harold nodded. "They will try to isolate it. They will try to sacrifice someone." "Yes." "And then they will try to move on." He met her gaze. "Only if we let them." She smiled then, just a little. "That's what I wanted to hear." Across the city, a junior attorney opened a file she had not been assigned and immediately wished she had not. She read until her lunch went cold. Then she kept reading. When she looked up, her hands were shaking. "This is bigger than a policy issue," she thought. "This is a mirror." By midday, Horizon Air's internal messaging system issued a directive. Mandatory listening sessions, anonymous reporting encouraged, review of discretionary language. The words were careful. The timing was not. Employees noticed. So did the people who had stopped believing those words meant anything. Harold received a call just after noon. Unknown number again. "They're accelerating," the voice said. "They always do," Harold replied, "right before they slow everything down." "Do you want to step in?" "Not yet." He hung up and looked out at the street below. People moved with purpose. No one knew what was unfolding above them. That was how it always went. Change did not announce itself. It waited until the noise reached a pitch it could no longer ignore. In a boardroom high above the city, William Hargrove stared at a slide he had seen before and never really read. Complaint resolution rate, average response time, demographic distribution. He felt something unfamiliar then. Not fear. Exposure. Somewhere between the numbers, the silence finally broke. And far from the glass and the jargon, an older man boarded a plane without incident, took his seat, and exhaled, unaware that the ground beneath the industry was already shifting, inch by inch, toward a reckoning that would not ask permission when it arrived. The morning briefing began with coffee no one touched and faces that refused to relax. Screens glowed around the room, charts frozen mid-slide as if time itself had hesitated. Margaret Sloane stood at the head of the table, palms flat, feeling the quiet thrum of a company holding its breath. "We have to talk about language," she said. "Not policy, not optics. Language." A murmur rippled. Someone shifted in a chair. Someone else checked a watch they did not need to check. Alan Pierce cleared his throat. "We've already instructed staff to be careful." Margaret did not look at him. "Careful is not the same as precise," she said, "and precision is what keeps us out of trouble." Across the table, a vice president with 30 years in operations leaned back. "This feels like overcorrection," he said. "We're reacting to a single complaint." Margaret lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "We are reacting to accumulated evidence," she said. "The complaint simply gave it a timestamp." The door opened late. A young man slipped in, breathless, carrying a tablet like a shield. "Sorry," he said. "Legal asked me to bring this up immediately." Margaret nodded. "Go ahead." He tapped the screen. Audio filled the room. A gate. A pause. A voice, practiced and neutral, asking a question it had no reason to ask. Then another pause. The kind that stretched, not with silence, but with judgment. No one spoke as the clip ended. William Hargrove closed his eyes. "Turn it off," he said softly. The room complied. "This is not about tone," Margaret said. "This is about assumptions embedded so deeply they sound like procedure." Alan leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" Margaret inhaled. She had rehearsed this, but rehearsal never removed the risk. "A full discretionary freeze," she said. "No rebookings without documented cause. No seat challenges without dual verification. And an external review of how comfort and safety are defined in practice." The vice president scoffed. "That will slow boarding to a crawl." "Yes," Margaret said. "And it will stop the bleeding." William opened his eyes. "Do it," he said. Alan stared at him. "You're serious?" William nodded. "I'd rather explain delays than explain intent." The meeting adjourned without applause, without relief. Decisions like this never came with either. Across town, Harold Bennett sat in a waiting room with chairs bolted to the floor and art chosen for neutrality. The man across from him kept glancing over, curious, then looking away. Harold noticed the habit. He noticed everything. A door opened. The woman with steel-grey hair from the day before appeared. She gestured him in. The room inside was smaller than memory allowed. No windows, no clocks. The air felt old, but not stale. Used. "They're moving," she said as soon as the door closed. "They always do once the mirror appears," Harold replied. She slid a folder across the table. "We pulled historical data," she said. "Complaints that never went public. Settlements framed as goodwill. Language sanitized." Harold opened it. He did not rush. Each page carried a weight that was not legal, but human. "They didn't invent this," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "They inherited it, and never questioned why." She leaned back. The review window just shifted. Harold looked up. "Forward?" "Yes." "How far?" She held his gaze. "Sooner than they think." He nodded. "Then they'll panic." "They already are." Across the city, the gate supervisor sat in a small office with frosted glass and a human resources representative whose voice stayed gentle even as her words hardened. "This is a formal inquiry," she said. "Not a termination. Yet." He swallowed. "I followed procedure." She nodded. "That's what we're examining." He stared at his hands. They shook despite his effort to still them. "No one ever told us not to," he said. She paused. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "that's the problem." At headquarters, emails multiplied. New directives, clarifications, a hotline number quietly added to the intranet. Managers were told to listen, to document, to escalate. Some did. Some resented it. Some recognized themselves in the examples and felt something crack. A veteran flight attendant closed her laptop and stared at the wall. She had used those phrases. Comfort, experience, balance. She had thought she was being kind. Her phone buzzed, a message from a colleague. "Did you hear what's happening?" She typed back slowly. "Yes, I think we should talk." At noon, a memo leaked. Not intentionally, just enough to move. The language was clinical. The effect was not. A journalist recognized the phrasing and felt the old itch behind his eyes. By early afternoon, questions were being asked that had no easy answers. By late afternoon, silence became impossible. William Hargrove stood alone in his office, city spread beneath him like a map of consequence. His phone rang. He did not answer it at first. He watched a plane lift off, slow and heavy, gaining altitude inch by inch. When he did answer, his voice was steady. "Yes," he said, "I know." He listened. He closed his eyes. He nodded to no one. "Send them in," he said finally. Margaret entered minutes later, legal team in tow. Her expression had shifted. Not fear, readiness. "They're asking for cooperation," she said. William nodded. "We'll give it." Alan frowned. "Full access?" "Yes," William said. "If we're going to be judged, it won't be for hiding." Margaret studied him. "This will change us." William looked tired. We needed changing. Outside the building, a protest formed without signs. Just people, standing, watching, waiting. Some had stories, some had scars, some had both. Harold walked past them on his way out of a different building across town. He did not stop. He did not wave. He carried their presence with him anyway. His phone buzzed once. A message from the steel gray-haired woman. "They're coming to you." He typed back. "Good." The sun dipped low, turning glass into fire. Inside Horizon Air, systems adjusted, permissions shifted, habits resisted. A company tried to relearn its own reflection, or the world watched the surface for cracks. And somewhere between policy and people, between memory and momentum, a reckoning gathered itself. Not loud yet, not final, but inevitable. Waiting for the moment when it would no longer ask whether it was welcome. The request arrived without ceremony, tucked inside a calendar invite that refused to explain itself. Mandatory executive session, no dial-in option, no proxies. William Hargrove read it twice, then once more, slower, as if pace might soften what it implied. He closed his laptop and stared at the wall where a framed mission statement hung, words he had once believed were sufficient protection. Across town, Harold Bennett stood in line at a small grocery store, one item in his basket, listening to a cashier complain gently about the price of eggs. He smiled at the familiarity of it. Life always continued, even when institutions trembled. His phone vibrated. A single line. Tomorrow, 8:30. Be ready. He paid in cash, old habit, left the store and stepped into air that felt sharper than it had the day before. By morning, the building on K Street had tightened its perimeter. Badges scanned twice. Names checked against lists that had been rewritten overnight. Hola passed through without comment, nodding to a guard who looked at him a second longer than necessary, then stepped aside. Recognition did not always come with clarity. The room was larger than the others. Oval table, screens on 3 walls, water pitchers untouched. A faint hum from somewhere above, the sound of systems awake before people were. Margaret Sloane stood near the far screen, reviewing notes she already knew by heart. Alan Pierce sat stiff-backed, hands clasped. William arrived last. He did not take the head seat. "Let's begin," he said, voice steady, and the room obeyed. Margaret tapped the screen. A timeline appeared. Not dates, patterns. Repeated phrases highlighted in muted color. Comfort concern, seating appropriateness, passenger profile review. Each one innocuous alone. Together, unmistakable. "This is not about intent," she said. "It's about impact, repeated often enough to become design." Alan shifted. "We're still talking about internal policy failures," he said, "not legal violations." Margaret looked at him. "Not yet," she said. "That window is closing." A knock interrupted her. Soft, precise. William looked up. "Yes?" The door opened and a man entered whom no one in the room recognized immediately. Mid-40s, plain suit, no briefcase. He carried nothing but a thin folder and a weight that settled the air the moment he crossed the threshold. "Apologies," the man said. "Traffic." William frowned. "You are?" The man smiled politely. "Daniel Cross, external oversight." Margaret's eyes flicked to Harold, who had taken a seat without announcement near the far end of the table. Harold did not react. He had expected this. Daniel took a seat without invitation. "I'll be brief," he said. "The review schedule has changed." Alan sat up. "On whose authority?" Daniel opened the folder. Did not slide it across. Just held it where everyone could see the header. Federal Transportation Oversight, Interim Authority. "Effective immediately," Daniel said. "This company is under enhanced observation." Silence pressed in, thick and heavy. William's voice was careful. "We were not notified." "You were," Daniel said. "You just didn't recognize the format." Margaret exhaled slowly. "What does this mean?" "It means," Daniel replied, "that what you call internal is no longer private." Alan stood. "This is premature." Daniel did not look at him. So were the assumptions that brought us here. Harold spoke then, not loud, not forceful. The room leaned toward him anyway. "You're being evaluated," he said, "not punished. Yet." William turned to him. "You knew this was coming." Harold met his gaze. "I knew it was possible." Margaret studied Harold with something like admiration and something like fear. "How long," she asked Daniel, "do we have?" Daniel closed the folder. "Before recommendations are made. Weeks, not months." Alan laughed, sharp and humorless. "This is absurd. You're basing this on narratives." Daniel finally looked at him. "We're basing it on silence," he said, "which is always the loudest data point." He stood. "I'll let you continue." When the door closed behind him, the room felt smaller. William sat down slowly. "All right," he said. "Let's stop pretending." He looked at Harold. "What do you want?" Harold folded his hands. The gesture was calm, deliberate. "I want you to listen," he said. "Not to me, to what you've been avoiding." Alan shook his head. "You orchestrated this." "No," Harold replied. "I witnessed it." Margaret leaned forward. "We need a plan," she said. "Now." William nodded. "We do, and it starts with accountability." Alan stared at him. "You can't be serious." William's voice hardened. "I am." The tension in the room shifted. Something unspoken surfaced. Outside, newsrooms stirred. A rumor without shape began to circulate. Analysts noticed unusual calendar activity. Stock tickers flickered, uncertain. At the same time, at a regional airport 2 states away, a woman in her 70s boarded a plane and hesitated when a gate agent looked at her too long. The agent glanced at a new memo on her screen, then smiled and waved the woman through. Small changes, almost invisible. Back in the room, Margaret spoke carefully. "If we proceed openly, we lose control." William looked at her. "If we don't, we lose everything else." Harold watched them, his expression unreadable. He felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Not triumph, responsibility. The kind that came when momentum finally aligned with memory. "You built something that worked," he said quietly. "Now you have to decide who it worked for." Alan pushed his chair back. "This is insane," he muttered. William did not stop him. As Alan left, the room exhaled. A reckoning rarely announced itself politely. It arrived through doors left open too long. Margaret gathered her papers. "They'll come for names next," she said. William nodded. "Then we'll give them names." Harold stood. "Then I'll step back," he said. William looked up sharply. "You're not finished." Harold met his gaze. "I am," he said. "What comes next belongs to you." He walked toward the door, slower than before, feeling the weight of what had shifted behind him. The system was awake now. It would not sleep easily again. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that somewhere inside its glass and steel, a line had finally been crossed. Not by anger, not by force, but by the quiet insistence that dignity was not negotiable, and never had been. The building emptied slower than usual that evening, as if people sensed that leaving too quickly might look like running. Lights stayed on in offices long past habit. Desks that once felt temporary now looked like places of judgment. Margaret Sloane remained at her desk, jacket folded, glasses off, staring at a yellow legal pad filled with handwriting she did not remember writing. Across the hall, an associate closed a door too quietly. The sound still carried. Margaret picked up the pad and read the words again. Enhanced observation. External access. Personnel review. The language was neutral, but she had spent her life translating neutral language into consequences. This was not a warning. This was a countdown. Her phone buzzed, a message from William. "Stay late, we need to talk." She did not reply. She stood, slipped her shoes back on, and walked down the corridor where framed photos celebrated years of record profits and smiling executives shaking hands with people who no longer worked there. History edited itself well in those frames. William's office was dark, except for the city beyond the glass. He stood with his back to the room, hands clasped, watching traffic grind below. When Margaret entered, he did not turn. "They'll ask for interviews," he said, "sooner than planned." "They already are," Margaret replied, quietly. William nodded. "Who's exposed?" Margaret took a breath. "More people than you think. Fewer than they deserve." He turned then. The lines in his face looked deeper. "And you?" She did not flinch. "Yes." William exhaled. "I never should have let it drift." "You did what most leaders do," Margaret said. "You trusted your distance." He gave a bitter smile. "Distance doesn't protect you. It just delays the hit." A knock interrupted them. Soft. Then the door opened without waiting. Alan Pierce stepped in, eyes sharp, jaw tight. "This is going too far," he said. "We're handing over control to people who don't understand our business." William met his gaze. "They understand power." Alan scoffed. "You're letting Bennett run this place." Margaret spoke before William could. "Harold Bennett isn't running anything," she said. "He stopped pretending we were." Alan laughed once, harsh. "He baited us." "No," Margaret said. "He exposed us." Alan looked at William. "You're going to sacrifice executives to save face." William's voice dropped. "I'm going to save the company." Alan shook his head. "At what cost?" William held his gaze. "The cost we've been avoiding." Silence pressed in. Alan's shoulders sagged just slightly. The fight drained out of him, replaced by something closer to fear. "This isn't how it was supposed to end," Alan said. "It isn't the end," Margaret replied. "It's the accounting." Alan turned away. "I need time." William nodded. "Take the night." After Alan left, Margaret stayed. "They'll come for the board," she said. William nodded. "They should." Margaret hesitated. "And Harold?" William looked at her. "What about him?" "He's still inside this," she said, "whether he wants to be or not." William turned back to the window. "Then we'd better be worthy of the scrutiny." Across town, Harold Bennett sat at his dining table with a single lamp on, papers spread in careful stacks. He had removed his watch. Old habit. When decisions mattered, he preferred to feel time rather than measure it. He read slowly. Interview summaries, behavioral audits, language reviews. The words were familiar, the faces less so. Each page carried a weight that pressed against his ribs. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered without greeting. "They're splitting," the voice said. Daniel Cross. Calm. Measured. "Yes," Harold replied. "They always do. The board wants to frame this as cultural drift." Harold smiled faintly. "Drift implies no one was steering." "They'll ask for your testimony." Harold closed the folder in front of him. "I won't testify." A pause. "You're sure?" "Yes." "That will be noticed." "Good." Another pause. "They may try to make you the story." "They already tried to make me invisible," Harold said. "This is better." Daniel exhaled. "You know what happens next?" "Yes," Harold replied. "People will say they didn't know." "And?" "And we will show them where they chose not to look." The call ended. Harold leaned back, eyes closed. He thought of the jet bridge again. The moment when stepping aside had felt like defeat to anyone watching, but had actually been leverage. Power was not always loud. Sometimes it waited. At the same time, in a quiet suburban house, the gate supervisor sat at his kitchen table, paperwork spread in front of him. His wife stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes searching his face. "What's happening?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "They say it's a review." She picked up one of the documents, read, looked up. "This doesn't feel like a review." He swallowed. "I did what I was trained to do." She nodded slowly. "Did you do what you knew was right?" He did not answer. In another part of the city, a junior analyst stared at a spreadsheet that refused to behave. Patterns emerged no matter how she filtered them. She sent an email to legal, then unsent it. Sent it again. "We need to talk." The reply came faster than expected. "Yes, we do." By morning, the company intranet displayed a new banner. Listening sessions mandatory. The font was neutral. The message was not. Employees gathered in small rooms, chairs arranged in circles instead of rows. Some spoke. Some cried. Some stayed silent, afraid that silence itself might now be interpreted. Margaret watched one session through a glass wall. A veteran attendant spoke about learning to read passengers without really seeing them, about using language that sounded gentle but landed sharp. Margaret wrote notes she never planned to erase. Harold arrived at the office mid-morning, unannounced, not invited, not blocked. He walked past reception with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need permission. Several people recognized him. No one stopped him. In a small conference room, he met with two investigators who had not slept enough. They asked careful questions. He gave careful answers. Nothing theatrical, nothing personal. At the end, one of them hesitated. "Why now?" she asked. Harold looked at her. "Because now there's proof," he said. "Before, there was only experience." She nodded slowly. When Harold left, the investigators sat in silence for a long moment. One finally spoke. "He's not angry." The other shook her head. "He's done waiting." That afternoon, a draft report circulated internally. Redacted, dense, unforgiving. Names were replaced with roles, patterns with percentages. No single villain, no easy fix. William read it alone in his office, hands trembling slightly despite his effort to still them. He reached the final page and closed his eyes. This would change them, permanently. Somewhere between the past they had inherited and the future they could still choose, the company stood exposed, not to punishment, but to itself. And in that exposure, something irreversible had begun. Quiet, steady, and far more dangerous than outrage. The first name was removed from the directory at 9:15 in the morning. No announcement, no explanation. Just an empty space where authority used to sit. Noticed first by assistants, who refreshed their screens and frowned, then by managers, who pretended not to notice at all. The company did not call it a termination. It called it a separation pending review. The language was careful. The effect was not. By 10, everyone knew. Margaret Sloane watched the change ripple through the building like a pressure shift. People spoke more softly. Doors closed more often. Laughter disappeared entirely. She had seen this before in other companies, other crises. The moment when the organization realized it could bleed. Her phone rang. Human resources. She did not answer it. Not yet. Across town, Harold Bennett sat in the back row of a small, windowless briefing room, hands folded, posture relaxed. Two investigators stood at the front, voices steady but tired. A projector hummed, casting charts onto the wall. Complaint frequency by category, escalation response time, resolution outcomes. The numbers were not shocking. They were worse than that. Predictable. "We've isolated 3 behavioral clusters," one investigator said. "Gate discretion, cabin reassignment, and post-incident language." Harold nodded once. The investigator continued. "The language changes, but the outcome doesn't." "Who taught them that language?" Harold asked. The room went quiet. The investigator hesitated. "Training materials, informal mentorship, cultural inheritance." Harold leaned back. "Then removing individuals won't fix it." "No," the investigator agreed. "But it will slow it." Harold considered that. Slowing harm was not the same as stopping it, but it was a start. He had learned long ago that perfection was often the enemy of momentum. At headquarters, William Hargrove sat across from Alan Pierce in a private office neither of them used anymore. The furniture felt borrowed now, temporary. "You're being asked to step aside," William said. Alan laughed, hollow. "That's a nice way to say it." "It's not permanent," William replied. "It never is," Alan said. "Until it is." William leaned forward. "I need you to understand something. This isn't about appeasement." Alan looked up sharply. "Then what is it about?" "Survival," William said. "And maybe redemption, if we're lucky." Alan stared at the wall. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, smaller. "I spent my life building this," he said. "So did I," William replied. "That's why we can't protect it from the truth." Silence stretched between them, heavy and personal. "I won't fight this," Alan said finally. "But don't pretend this ends clean." William nodded. Nothing honest ever does. When Alan left, his badge still worked. For now. The hallway seemed longer than before. People avoided his eyes, not out of judgment, but fear of proximity. Contagion did not require contact, just association. By noon, the internal hotline lit up. Calls came in halting at first, then faster. Stories that had been told before and ignored, others that had never been told at all. A flight attendant in her early 60s spoke about being trained to redirect older passengers without ever being told why. A supervisor admitted he had learned to read discomfort in the faces of some passengers and authority in others. The words fell into the system like stones into water. Each one sent a ripple. Together, they changed the surface. Margaret entered one of the listening sessions unannounced and took a seat in the circle. No podium, no notes, just chairs and people. A man with white hair and a pilot's posture spoke quietly. "We were told to keep things smooth," he said. Smooth meant fast. Fast meant assumptions. No one interrupted him. A woman across the circle folded her hands. "I thought I was being helpful," she said. "I didn't see who I was helping." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, recognition. Outside the room, a junior associate leaned against the wall, listening through the door. She had typed the same language into reports without ever questioning its shape. She felt ashamed, but also strangely alert, like someone waking from a long sleep. At 1:30, a journalist called. Margaret let it ring. At 2, another name disappeared from the directory. This one was noticed immediately. Emails flew. Screenshots circulated. Speculation sharpened into certainty. The market reacted, not violently, but nervously. Analysts adjusted language. Investors asked questions that had no good answers yet. In a regional office 3 states away, a gate agent stood in front of her manager, eyes wet but defiant. "If this is about that memo," she said, "I want it on record that I never liked the way we were told to do it." The manager nodded. "It's on record now." The agent exhaled. She did not know whether that would save her. She knew only that it was true. Harold received the update on his phone as he walked through a quiet park near the river. 2 names, one confirmed, one rumored. He sat on a bench and watched a man feed birds with deliberate patience. "This is the ugly part," Daniel Cross said, appearing beside him without greeting. Harold nodded. "The necessary part. They're starting to blame each other. They always do. And they're starting to understand the scope." Harold watched the birds scatter and return. "Understanding comes in waves," he said. "This is the first one." Daniel looked at him. "You could stop this." Harold turned. "How?" "By stepping in publicly. By framing it." Harold shook his head. "If I do that, they learn how to perform accountability, not how to live it." Daniel sighed. "You really believe they can change?" "I believe they must," Harold replied. "Belief has nothing to do with it." Back at headquarters, William stood before the board in a room that had never felt so small. Faces stared back at him, some angry, some afraid, some already resigned. "This is not a purge," he said. "It's a reckoning." One member scoffed. "You're destroying confidence." William met his gaze. Confidence built on denial deserves destruction. Another leaned forward. "What if this spirals?" "It already has," William said. "The question is whether we spiral with it, or stand still long enough to learn." No one applauded. They did not need to. The moment did not allow for theatre. As evening settled, the building grew quiet again, but not calm. Something fundamental had shifted. Not the policy, not the language. The willingness to look. Margaret packed her bag slowly. She paused at her desk, running her fingers over the legal pad filled with notes that no longer felt abstract. Tomorrow would bring more names, more calls, more consequences. She turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, where the hum of the building felt different now. Less protective, more honest. Across the city, Harold stood from the bench and continued walking. The sky darkened, the river reflecting lights that blurred at the edges. He felt the weight of the day settle into his bones, familiar and unwelcome. This was never about punishment, he thought. It was about interruption. And once interrupted, a system could not pretend it had never been touched. Somewhere, someone would lose a job they had believed was secure. Somewhere else, someone would board a plane tomorrow and sit without being questioned, never knowing why the air felt slightly different. The change would not announce itself. It never did. But it had begun. The hearing room was smaller than Harold had imagined, which told him everything he needed to know. Power rarely required space. It preferred proximity. The chairs were bolted to the floor. The table bore scratches from years of elbows and papers pressed too hard. A seal hung on the wall, worn smooth at the edges by time and indifference. Harold took his seat without being told where to sit. No one corrected him. Across the room, the panel assembled with practiced efficiency. 3 members, all older, all carrying the quiet confidence of people who had outlasted crises before. Margaret Sloane entered last, legal pad tucked under her arm, face composed, eyes tired. She did not look at Harold at first. She did not need to. The chair cleared his throat. "This session is closed," he said. "The record will reflect that." Harold listened to the scrape of chairs, the soft click of a recorder switching on. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, but memory. Rooms like this had existed long before him. He had learned how to breathe inside them. "We're here to assess systemic risk," the chair continued, "not individual blame." Harold almost smiled. Language always softened itself at the threshold. Margaret was invited to speak first. She stood, adjusted her glasses, and began without preamble. She did not defend. She did not deny. She described. Patterns. timelines, decisions made by default, silence mistaken for consent. Each sentence landed cleanly, without flourish. The kind of testimony that made it harder to argue because it refused to argue at all. When she finished, the room was quiet, not tense, focused. The chair nodded. "Thank you," he said, "Mr. Bennett." Harold stood slowly. He did not bring notes. He had never trusted paper to carry what needed to be felt. "I was asked to speak about what I observed," he said. "I'm going to speak about what I remembered." A pause. He let it stretch. "I remembered the first time I learned how systems teach people to look past you," he continued. "Not because they hate you, because they don't need you. And when they don't need you, they don't see you." One of the panel members shifted. Another leaned forward. "I boarded a plane," Harold said. "I had a ticket. I followed instructions. I was moved anyway. Not violently, not loudly. Gently, like furniture." Margaret's jaw tightened. This wasn't new, Harold went on. What was new was that it was documented, that someone finally wrote down the assumptions instead of letting them evaporate into habit. The chair raised a hand. "We understand the experience," he said. "What we're trying to determine is scale." Harold nodded. "Then look at who never filed complaints," he said. "Look at who learned early that complaining cost more than it returned." Silence again, thicker this time. A panel member spoke. "Are you suggesting this was intentional?" "No," Harold replied. "I'm suggesting it was convenient." Margaret inhaled sharply, then steadied herself. Harold continued. "Intent comforts people. Systems don't run on intent. They run on repetition." The chair leaned back. "You're aware that this review could trigger penalties," he said. "Yes." "And reputational damage?" "Yes." "And leadership changes?" Harold met his gaze. "Those are outcomes," he said, "not causes." The panel exchanged looks. Something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The hearing was no longer about whether there was a problem, it was about how much courage would be required to name it. When Harold finished, he sat without ceremony. His heart was steady. His hands did not shake. Outside the room, reporters waited. Microphones poised, cameras ready. A hunger in their eyes that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with timing. Margaret exited first. She stopped just short of the doors, squared her shoulders, and spoke. "We are cooperating fully," she said. "We are committed to change." A reporter shouted a question. Another followed. Margaret answered neither. She stepped aside and let the doors close. Inside, William Hargrove watched the live feed from his office, volume muted. He saw Margaret's face, Harold's posture. He felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for years. His phone rang. A board member. He let it ring once more than usual before answering. "Yes," he said. "I saw it." A pause. "No," he said again. "We won't push back." Another pause. Longer. His voice dropped. "Because pushing back is what got us here." He hung up and stared at the screen as the footage replayed silently. He recognized the man he had been. He did not miss him. Across town, a junior flight attendant sat in her car with the engine off, listening to a replay on her phone. She watched Harold speak without raising his voice, without accusation. She felt tears come unexpectedly, not from sadness, but from relief. At a regional airport, a supervisor closed a gate and stood still for a moment before turning to the next task. He thought about language, about how often he had chosen ease over fairness. He felt the discomfort settle in. He did not push it away. By evening, the market reacted. Not with panic, with recalibration. Analysts adjusted forecasts. Investors asked different questions. Not whether profits would fall, but whether trust could be rebuilt. In the hearing room, the panel reconvened privately. Papers were shuffled. Words were chosen carefully. "We're recommending provisional oversight," the chair said. "External monitoring. Mandatory reporting." A panel member nodded. "And leadership accountability." Another added, "And a public framework." They all agreed. No dissent. That surprised them. When Harold received the message, he was walking home. The sun had dipped low, painting the city in copper and shadow. He stopped on a bridge and watched the water move beneath him, steady, indifferent. It's begun, he thought. Not the punishment, the work. His phone buzzed again, a text from Margaret. They listened. He typed back slowly. Then it's our turn to listen harder. He put the phone away and continued walking. He felt tired now, bone tired. The kind of tired that followed truth spoken aloud. Behind him, the city glowed. Ahead of him, the night waited. Somewhere, a company was learning that compliance was not the same as conscience, and that history did not repeat itself loudly, but patiently, until someone interrupted it. Harold crossed the bridge and disappeared into the street, carrying with him no satisfaction, no triumph, only the quiet knowledge that something older than policy had finally been acknowledged, and that acknowledgement, once made, could not be taken back. The announcement came early, before most people had settled into their desks, before the building had fully woken up. An internal alert, plain language, no flourish. External oversight confirmed. Interim leadership adjustments effective immediately. Margaret Sloane read it on her phone while standing in an elevator that seemed to rise too slowly. No one spoke. No one checked their reflection. When the doors opened, the silence stepped out with them. By 9, the cameras arrived. They lined the sidewalk across from headquarters, lenses pointed upward, waiting for faces that might explain what words could not. Employees entered through side doors, heads down, badges visible, movements cautious. The building had become a symbol overnight, and symbols invited projection. William Hargrove watched from the 32nd floor as reporters adjusted tripods and producers argued into headsets. He felt older than his years, but clearer than he had in decades. He straightened his tie and picked up the folder on his desk. It was thinner than he expected. That, too, told him something. Margaret knocked once and entered. She closed the door behind her. "It's official," she said. William nodded. "I saw. They want a public statement before noon." "They'll get one," he replied, "but not the one they expect." Margaret studied him. "You're sure?" William exhaled. "If we try to sound innocent, we'll sound dishonest. I'm tired of that voice." She nodded slowly. "Then we should prepare for fallout." "Prepare for responsibility," William corrected. "Fallout implies accident." Downstairs, Alan Pierce sat in a temporary office with no windows and a desk that did not belong to him. His badge still worked, but only on certain doors. He stared at the screen in front of him, unread emails stacking like unanswered questions. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hearing room. Harold's voice, calm, unyielding. This wasn't how power ended, he thought. It was supposed to be louder. At 10:30, the board convened again. This time, no one argued about process. The vote passed without dissent. William felt the weight of it settle, not as loss, but as alignment. Across town, Harold Bennett sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, watching a live stream on mute. The banner beneath the footage read what he had expected it to read. Oversight, Review, accountability. His phone buzzed. "They're asking for comment," Daniel Cross wrote. Harold typed back. "No comment." A pause. "They're pushing." Harold stared at the screen, then set the phone face down. He had said what he needed to say. The rest was not his to narrate. At 11:45, William stepped into the press room alone. No flanking executives, no legal shield. Just a microphone and a company that had finally stopped pretending. "We failed," he said. The room stilled. "We failed to see patterns we should have recognized. We failed to listen when listening would have been easier than now. And we failed to act before acting became unavoidable." Questions erupted. William raised a hand. "This is not about a single incident," he continued. "It's about a culture that allowed discretion to replace fairness. That ends today." The cameras captured every word, every blink, every breath. "We are accepting external oversight," William said. "We are restructuring leadership, and we are opening our processes to scrutiny, not because we were forced, but because we should have done it years ago." A reporter shouted, "Is this because of Harold Bennett?" William did not hesitate. "This is because of what we ignored," he said. "Mr. Bennett simply refused to let us ignore it again." The room buzzed. Headlines wrote themselves. By early afternoon, the market stabilized. Not recovered, stabilized. The difference mattered. Margaret watched the coverage from her office, volume low. She saw the words chosen, the framing. She saw the shift from outrage to curiosity. Curiosity was harder to manage, but more honest. Her phone rang. Human resources. Again. She answered this time. "We've completed the first wave," the voice said. "There will be more." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Do it carefully," she said, "and do it fairly." At a regional airport, a gate agent watched the press conference on her phone between boarding calls. She listened to the word "failed" and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because the company was hurting, but because someone had finally named what she had felt, but never said. She put the phone away and smiled at the next passenger. Not the trained smile. A real one. At 4, Howard received a call he had not expected. A blocked number. He answered anyway. "You could have stopped this sooner," the voice said. Harold recognized it. A former colleague. Same age, different choices. "Yes," Harold replied. "So could you." Silence. "They're rewriting the rules," the voice said. "They always were," Harold replied. "You just didn't like who they protected." The line went dead. As evening approached, the city settled into its rhythms again. Traffic thickened. Lights came on. People talked about other things. That, Harold knew, was the sign of real change. When outrage gave way to integration. When the extraordinary began to fade into the ordinary. At headquarters, employees gathered in small groups after work, conversations low, thoughtful. Some were afraid, some were hopeful. Most were both. Margaret walked past them on her way out, nodding, listening without intruding. She knew tomorrow would be harder. Tomorrow always was. William stayed late. He sat alone in his office, lights off, city glowing beyond the glass. He thought about legacy. Not the kind engraved on plaques, but the kind that settled quietly into systems and stayed there. He picked up his phone and typed a message. "Thank you for not letting us look away." He sent it before he could second-guess himself. Harold read the message an hour later, standing at his window, watching the city breathe. He did not reply immediately. Gratitude was complicated. He had learned that, too. When he finally typed back, he kept it simple. Do better. He put the phone down and turned away from the window. He felt no triumph, no vindication. only the steady weight of something finally in motion. Tomorrow there would be meetings, reports, resistance, progress measured in inches. But tonight, something had shifted. Not because a man spoke loudly, but because a system was forced to listen. And listening, once begun, was a habit that could not be easily unlearned. The first morning after the cameras left felt quieter than it should have, like the pause after a storm when debris is still settling and no one is sure what survived. Harold Bennett woke before dawn, as he always did, and stood by the window watching the city breathe itself awake. Buses hissed. A delivery truck idled. Somewhere, a siren rose and faded. Systems resumed. That was how change proved it was real, not in speeches, but in routines that continued under new weight. At headquarters, the lobby lights came on one by one. The banner was gone. The security desk felt the same, and entirely different. People walked slower, not timid, intentional. Margaret Sloane arrived early, carrying nothing but a notebook and the fatigue of the last weeks. She nodded to the guard, who nodded back with a seriousness he hadn't carried before. Inside, calendars filled again. Not with damage control, with work. The interim oversight team occupied a modest suite that had once been a branding office. The walls were bare now. Screens showed dashboards stripped of vanity. Complaint intake, resolution timelines, language audits. Nothing hidden behind percentages alone. Names were redacted. Patterns were not. Margaret watched the numbers refresh and felt a strange steadiness. Accountability had a rhythm once you let it in. William Hargrove arrived without an entourage. He set his phone face down, opened a legal pad, and listened. He listened when the oversight lead described gaps that would take months to close. He listened when a veteran flight attendant spoke about unlearning phrases she had used for decades. He listened when a junior analyst admitted fear and relief in the same sentence. The room did not perform. It worked. Across the country, a training session began at a regional airport. Chairs in a circle, no podium, no slides at first. A facilitator asked for silence, not to control it, but to make space. Stories followed, some halting, some precise. None dismissed. A man in his late 60s spoke about boarding a plane without bracing his shoulders for the first time in years. No applause followed, just nods. That mattered more. By mid-morning, Harold walked into a small community center where he volunteered twice a week. The director smiled, pressed a clipboard into his hands, and asked if he could help stack chairs. He did. His back protested. He welcomed it. Power, he knew, had to be grounded somewhere physical, or it rotted into abstraction. As he worked, a woman recognized him, then thought better of it and said nothing. He appreciated that restraint. Recognition was loud. Change was quieter. At noon, the Oversight Bulletin posted its first update. Plain language, clear deadlines, no victory laps. The market barely noticed. That, too, felt like progress. Margaret read the comments coming in through internal channels. Some were defensive. Many were grateful. A few were brave enough to be specific. She saved those. Specificity was the seed of reform. In the afternoon, William met with leaders who would not keep their titles. The meetings were not dramatic. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just clarity. Roles would change. Some would end. The company would help where it could, not as absolution, as responsibility. When one man asked whether this would ever stop defining them, William answered without rehearsing. It would define them only if they refused to learn. Later, Harold sat on a bench by the river, watching the water carry reflections that bent and broke and reformed downstream. Daniel Cross joined him, hands in pockets, posture looser than before. They spoke briefly. Oversight timelines, reporting standards. The kind of details that never made headlines and made all the difference. When Daniel left, Harold stayed. He watched a family feed birds. He watched a cyclist slow for a pedestrian. He watched ordinary choices add up. As evening came on, the city returned to its habits. Restaurants filled, offices emptied. The headquarters building dimmed floor by floor. Margaret shut down her computer and paused, listening to the hum. She felt tired in a clean way. The work would continue tomorrow. It would continue long after names faded from memory. That was the point. William sent one last message before leaving his office. It went to the entire company. It was short. We are accountable to people, not appearances. Do the work. He did not add a signature. Authority no longer needed one. Harold walked home under a sky washed pale by the city's glow. His phone buzzed with notes from strangers and friends and people who had waited a long time to feel seen. He did not answer most of them. He saved a few. He understood the arc. Attention flared and moved on. What remained was practice. At home, he set his watch on the table and washed his hands. He thought about the gate, the pause, the choice to step aside that had not been surrender, but strategy. He thought about how systems changed when interrupted by calm persistence. He thought about the next interruption, because there was always a next one. Night settled. The city did not applaud. It adjusted. Somewhere, a passenger boarded a plane and took a seat without calculation. Somewhere else, a supervisor chose language with care. Somewhere, a complaint became a correction before it became a wound. That was enough for now. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe for more stories like it, and comment 3 words. Stand for dignity.